During the Second World War and following the invasion of Poland, around 22,000 Polish military officers and members of the intelligentsia were massacred by the Soviet Union's secret police. It is well known that the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany was deemed one step too far and regarded as the start of the Second World War. It might be less well known that at the same time that the German armed forces invaded Poland, so too was the Soviet Union's Red Army in a vicious pincer. Many Polish officers and a select class of people were sent to prison camps to be murdered and their fates covered up. In today's video, we will look at the events leading up to the imprisonment of so many, at just how the Katyn massacre could take place, and the consequences for the Polish-Soviet relations. It is perhaps helpful to start with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany on the 23rd of August 1939. It was a non-aggression pact that, whilst stopping short of a full alliance, would mean the two countries would maintain peace between one another. In addition to the public face of the treaty, there was a series of secret protocols. Both countries laid land claims to the likes of Finland, Lithuania, and notably for this video, Poland. It set out how through an invasion from the west and east, Poland would be conquered and divided between the two aggressors. It might seem odd that Nazi Germany would tolerate any relationship with the communist Soviet Union. After all, the anti-Semitic theories of Jewish Bolshevism, the Nazi desires for living space for German people in the East, and their belief in that the Slavic races were inferior should mean that any treaty would be impossible. But with Britain, and by extension France, insisting that any Nazi attempts to invade Poland would be met with force, there would be the danger of fighting a war on two fronts, with Britain, France, and the rest of Europe in the west, and the Soviet Union in the east, something the Germans wanted to avoid following their experience during World War I. This resulted in Hitler having to consider relations with the Soviet Union, however temporary it may be. Likewise for the Soviet Union, they would be acutely aware of the Nazi desire to both occupy and destroy them. The Soviet Union were fearful of invasion and annexation by Nazi Germany, and that such acts would be tolerated by the other European powers, as was evident throughout the 1930s. Therefore, any peace that could be obtained would allow the Soviet Union to modernize their armed forces and prepare for a potential conflict. For example, following the treaty, the Soviet Union traded vast stockpiles of grain, oil and ore in exchange for Nazi armaments and modern weaponry samples. Both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany approached the Non-Aggression Pact as a pragmatic solution to their problems, regardless as to whether it was with an enemy that was antithetical to their respective beliefs. The signing of the Non-Aggression Pact on the 23rd of August 1939 was shortly followed by the Nazi invasion of Poland on the 1st of September. The Nazi blitzkrieg pushed the Polish army back towards the capital city of Warsaw within a matter of days. Germany's technological and numeral superiority when it came to tanks and planes crushed the Polish army, which relied on its large and now ineffective cavalry, though they were hoping for the British and French armed forces to offer some semblance of support. However, on the 17th of September 1939, the Soviet Union invaded under the pretense of restoring order. The Soviet Union falsely claimed that the Polish government had fallen, and so they were stepping in to protect ethnic Belarusian and Ukrainian Poles. Anywhere between 300 and 500,000 Polish prisoners of war were captured and deported to the Soviet Union. This included a number of educated and members of the Polish cultural elite who served as officers in the Polish Reserve Army. Many people ended up in prison camps run by the NKVD, Stalin's infamous secret police force. The goal of the NKVD was to identify which of the prisoners were willing and capable of being integrated into the Soviet Union. Those who were deemed incapable of assimilation were listed as enemies to the Soviet Union. Many of these people were high-ranking members of the military, including admirals and generals, members of Polish royalty and university professors. On the 5th of March 1940, Stalin and his leading members of his Politburo signed a memo to the head of the NKVD, Lavrentiy Beria, ordering the execution of over 25,000 Polish prisoners deemed to be the biggest threats. These people were the key players in Polish culture and leadership, and in targeting these people, Stalin attempted to destroy Polish resistance to Soviet assimilation. Anti-Polish actions were standard fare for Beria and his NKVD. From 1937 to 1938, around 111,000 Polish people living in the Soviet Union were executed by the NKVD, under the cover of purging those deemed to be conducting espionage. In April of 1940, the execution started. In all, 21,857 people were executed. Of those people, around 14,000 were prisoners of war of all ranks, from generals to privates. The remaining 7,000 were made up of journalists, doctors, lawyers, and other members of the Polish cultural elite. The usual method of execution would involve a prisoner first being made to sign and confirm their identity. They would be taken to a room with a hose and a drain in the middle. The prisoner would be shot in the back of the head with a single bullet. The body was removed, the room was washed down, and the next prisoner would be brought in. Such executions would take place every 3 minutes throughout the night over the course of 28 days. It is even reported that Vasily Bolkin, a favoured NKVD executioner, was personally responsible for around 7,000 executions in this manner. His weapon of choice was a Volta Model 2 pistol, as these had less recoil and so meant less strain on his wrist. Such pistols were received following the Non-Aggression Pact, but would also provide a level of plausible deniability as German-made bullets would be found in the corpses. Many of the bodies were buried in mass graves in the Katyn forest, with the Soviets hoping that this would be the end of the matter. After all, it was but a small drop in the ocean of blood spilled by the NKVD. But matters would change. On the 22nd of June 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. As the Red Army was pushed back, and more territory was taken by the German armed forces, it raised issues for the Soviets in respect of the bodies buried in Katyn. The Polish government in exile, headed by General Władysław Sikorski, was now allied with the Soviet Union and in the fight against Nazi Germany. Questions were raised as to those Polish soldiers still imprisoned in the Russian camps. Thousands were released to form new battalions, vital to fight in the Eastern Front. But the question was raised as to the whereabouts of the thousands of missing officers, which represented 50% of the army leadership. When General Sikorski met Stalin in person, he was assured that the missing men had likely fled to Manchuria following their release, and that their whereabouts could not be confirmed due to the massive scale of the Soviet Union. This stalling tactic would be put to the test when in the early months of 1943, rumours abounded of mass graves in the Katyn forest. Upon receiving reports of the mass graves, Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, was eager to exploit the massacre. The Red Cross and German medical officers, along with captured British medical officers, oversaw the exhumation of thousands of bodies. A commission was established with representatives from many countries. It became very clear that the victims, still dressed in their winter clothes with their identification documents to hand, were murdered at the time when the area was held by the Soviets. The documents discovered on the bodies had a date no later than April 1940. These documents and the forensic evidence helped investigators establish the dates of the executions. Some 12,000 bodies were discovered during this time. It is important to remember that the Nazis' goal was not justice for the dead Polish officers. They themselves had committed countless murders against the Polish people, both during the early months of the war and when the Einsatzgruppen were unleashed to massacre those the Nazis deemed undesirable. Goebbels intended to strain the relationship between Poland and by extension the rest of the Allied forces and the Soviet Union. It was to show the hypocrisy or the weak-willed nature of the Allies in how they were willing to work with such a murderous regime. The Soviets of course denied any part in the massacres. They insisted the victims were captured by the German forces in 1941, and that they had been murdered by the Nazi forces after being used as forced labour. Stalin also broke off diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile, under the pretense the Polish authorities were colluding with the Nazi regime. But as the tides of the war turned against the Nazis, the area of Katyn was retaken by the Soviet forces. Immediately, the Soviets began the process of destroying evidence and coercing witnesses. Fake documents were created and planted on the corpses. A Soviet report declared falsely that the Polish officers were murdered by the Germans. For the Allied forces, it was clear that the Soviets were to blame, yet they needed to maintain good relations with Stalin. Unfortunately for the Polish government in exile, General Sikorski died in a plane crash in July of 1943. Polish influence over the Allied forces, already fading, died along with Sikorski. Ultimately, the Soviet Union proved more than vital to defeating the Nazis. The vast majority of the German war machine was tied up in the Eastern Front, with millions of Soviet troops dying in some of the fiercest fighting. It is hard to imagine a scenario where the war could be fought simultaneously in the European and Pacific theatres without Soviet involvement. This, however, is not the end of the Katyn massacre. For starters, at the Nuremberg Trial, where the Allied forces sought to hold those who had committed genocides during the war to account, the Soviets attempted to add the Katyn massacre to the charge sheet. This was rejected by the British and Americans, though highlights how the Soviets tried to legitimize their false claims. It was not until 1989 that it was first revealed that Stalin had ordered the Katyn massacre. In 1990, Boris Yeltsin, the Russian president following the Soviet Union's collapse, released documents about the Katyn massacre to the Polish government. In an eerie mirror to the plane crash that killed General Sikorski, the Polish president, Lech Kaczynski, died in a plane crash en route to the mark of the 70th anniversary of the massacre, of course, leading to conspiracy theories. The Katyn massacre is a grim reminder of the brutality of the Soviet Union. A tragedy of thousands murdered for the crime of merely refusing to recant their nationality. But it is also a story of the political intrigue of the Second World War. The alliances that were made, broken, and strained in the course of this tale reminds us how the chaos of war can be shaped by such politics. It is also the tale of two murderous regimes, both with plenty of blood already on their hands, attempting to use the murder of Polish officers for political gain. Neither the Soviets nor the Nazis had any moral authority to chastise the other for the murder of Polish citizens, having both already committed the same crimes in the preceding years.